Did you get the notification that I'm recording? Yeah, okay. Good, so I will let people in, okay? Okay, so good evening, everyone, or a good morning, depending on where you are right now. My name is Matteo Bertele. I'm professor of contemporary art history at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. And I am organized together with Sven Speaker Professor Speaker from University of California, Santa Barbara, an online series of lectures about the art of the GDR. And today it's our last meeting, our last online meeting. And it's my pleasure to have as our last but not least guest, Oliver Sukrow, who is online with us. I will briefly introduce Oliver, who is an art historian and architectural historian. He's a postdoc researcher at a research unit, art history of the Technische Universität in Vienna, where he's co-leading a project on the post-1945 school architecture in Austria, the GDR, and Slovenia. He has also recently joined the Department of Architectural Theory and Science at the Technische Universität Darmstadt as an assistant professor, where he teaches architecture and landscape art of the 19th and 20th century. He holds a PhD from the University of Heidelberg and is an expert member of the International Scientific Committee on the 20th Century Heritage of ICOMOS. His PhD thesis on utopian thinking in the visual arts and architecture of the GDR in the 60s was published in 2018 with Heidelberg University Press. He has extensively published on the art of the GDR, including a monograph on artist Lea Grundig, and was editor of the volume Zwischen Sputnik und Ölkrise, Kybernetik in Architektur, Planung und Design. And his book, Haus der Kultur-Gera, was on the shortlist of the German Book Award and the winner of the DAM Architectural Book Award 2021 in Frankfurt, Main. He's currently preparing 2 book-length studies related to the GDR, an anthology on applied art in the GDR, and 1 monographic study on the architect and urban planner Josef Kaiser. So I will give you the floor, Oliver, for your presentation, which is titled New Images and Spaces of Man, the 60s in the GDR Revisited. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Matteo. Thank you, Sven, for having me and for inviting me to this brilliant lecture series and for the nice introduction. It's an honor and pleasure at the same time speaking to you. I have to confess that I wasn't able to listen to every presentation due to my recent change from Vienna to Darmstadt, as Matteo was saying. But I will hope that we will continue this conversation in various ways. So I hope this is not the end, even though it's the last lecture. All right, I hope you can see my presentation. It's running. Perfect.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So new images and spaces of men. The title of my presentation is a double allusion, as you can guess. One point of reference is the idea of socialist theory that art and architecture not only represent social and economic contexts, but are active actors of change at the same time. While Stalin, Ulbricht, and Honecker were relatively skeptic towards the image and preferred the text, the post-Stalinist epoch, the global 60s, and a so-called socialist modernism pushed architecture and the visual arts at the forefront of ideological and theoretical discourses on representation and politics. The second point of reference is the famous Cold War exhibition, or I call it Cold War exhibition, New Images of Men, shown in 1959 at the MoMA, that marked one entry point into the 60s. In New York, but also in East Berlin or Warsaw or Kiev, the 1960s challenged conventional images of socialist stereotypes and heroes, images of female workers and scientists, but also of nature and landscape, as the wonderful catalogue by Jérôme Bazin and Joanna Kodiak for the Saketa National Gallery of Art in Warsaw has argued a couple of years ago. New images and spaces, the environment or the landscape of these new men and women was also discussed transnationally. For example, during the so-called Darmstadt talks that happened between 1950 and 1975. Organized by leading West German intellectuals like Adorno, the Darmstadt talks attracted conservative and progressive thinkers alike, as well as Eastern intellectuals. In 1950, the first Darmstadt talk was devoted to the image of man in our times, the second and the third to man in space and man in technology, and the 68 talk to man and images of man. While the 50s and the first peaks of the Cold War are prominent topics of GDR historiography, the 60s and especially the reform movements were a relatively new subject of research. But ever since Wolfgang Engler's Die Ostdeutschen of 1999, the last decade of Ulbricht's government between the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 and the change of power from Ulbricht to Honecker 10 years later in 1971 has gained more and more attention by historiographers. It's state of the art to emphasize the double-faced character of this decade between progressive attempts in economy, society, and culture on one side, and oppressive political and ideological positions on the other side. And maybe coincident, but just a couple of days ago, a new debate on how the GDR's history should be narrated emerged in German feuilleton, evoked by two controversial publications. One is by Katja Heuer, Beyond the Wall, and the other one is by Dirk Oschmann, you see on the right side. And there's, I just read today new reviews of these books, so it's kind of a very dynamic environment right now. So the GDR image is moving, or is discussed still, and it's not yet clear in which direction the coming to terms will go. It is even more unclear, I would say, than it was supposed to be in the decades following the reunification of 1990. In parallel to these developments in historiography, also in the field of history of art, debates on the perspectives on GDR cultural history emerge regularly from time to time. Within those generational cycles, the state of the art is critically re-examined. In the early 1990s, in the early 2000s, in the 2010s. And one could say that your lecture series is also remapping this territory. I'm not sure whether the West German art history after 1945 has received any kind of this attention and methodological experiments. But today's presentation is not about historiographic trends, nor is it about the global 1960s. What I'm trying to do today is to discuss a case study of how the visual arts and architecture and urban planning of the 60s in the GDR were developing a new code of science and new layers of meaning. The designed environment played a very important role in enabling technologically and spatially new images of men and women that were represented through public artworks at these public spaces. Those new spaces of social interaction and political meaning were an integral part of most of the so-called new towns that were constructed since the late 1950s everywhere in the GDR. As built utopias, these new towns should enable the society to transform into a new form of socialist collective that did not only live anymore in bourgeois housing complexes, but was also designed and crafted to form a new environment with new forms and functions. Although the expectations on the transformative power of the housing complexes was not a unique and new historical phenomenon, the sheer size and the scale of the building projects of the GDR underline the ambitious program. This explains, among other things, why artists and designers had very important roles to fill in for the realization process of the new towns. In today's presentation, I will speak about one artist that was especially active in the 1960s and 70s and was responsible for creating at least new images of man, at least some new images of man. Josep Renau was an outstanding figure in the East German art scene of the 1960s. Since '58, Renau represented an alternative, non-Soviet artistic style and practice. This held especially true for his preferred medium, the large-scale public mural painting. For that reason, among others, most of his proposals for public murals were rejected by party officials, often accused of being too difficult to understand and for being ideologically indifferent. I'm arguing that while murals were intended by socialist cultural theory to be the most appropriate version of permanent propaganda in the public sphere due to its size and clear visuality, Renaud challenged this one-dimensional top-down approach between the artwork and the viewer by combining stylistic and formal elements of the avant-garde with socialist iconography and an innovative work in progress to create what contemporary critics in the GDR called, quote, complex compositions for the built environment. His murals always allowed for moving observers within an urban setting of the new socialist living complexes like Halle Neustadt or Erfurt Nord that were both seen as cities of a socialist future. Renaud's works, as well as his more or less theoretical texts on his approach to muralism, show why his unique style and technique was both an attempt for possible contemporary artistic expression in modern socialism, as well as a critique of the still followed dogmatic concepts of socialist realism. As recognizable from recent publication and exhibitions, it is obvious that Renaud's exiles were highly productive and challenging years from various perspectives. While Renaud's Mexican experience was one closely connected to the avant-garde movement in the Americas, an artistic and political anti-fascist practice, the years in the GDR, nearly a quarter of a century, are not so much characterized by his international reputation and skills, but were more focused on artistic exertion and collective art practice. Especially after Franco's death, Renaud made several attempts to re-establish himself within the canon of Spanish Republican art history, while neglecting more and more his artistic practice in the GDR. That allowed his collective, friends and pupils, to adapt at least his final project in the GDR, a mural in Erfurt, that was finished 2 years after Renaud's death in 1982. Despite this generational shift, why is it interesting to research Renaud's oeuvre in the GDR at all? I propose that this question could be answered on 4 levels. The first one, Renaud's artistic aesthetic qualities include work in small scale, so paintings and photomontages, as well as monumental dimensions. In this regard, his artistic production shows a unique diversity in form, technique, and concept compared to many other artists in the GDR. Second reason, Renaud's analytical artistic approach grants us a unique insight into his ideas and concepts for public art in a socialist society. The third one, Renaud's networks can be read as signifiers for his social and artistic position within the art system of the GDR, which I would describe as peripheral and isolated from most of the official circles, although he had some powerful and important friends. And fourth and final point, Renaud's works in GDR represent an interesting example of the afterlife and development of the avant-garde in a post-war socialist society. In a particularly vivid and artistic way, Renaud's experiences, Mexican experiences and Spanish experiences, can be comprehended on the basis of the wall painting, The March of Youth into the Future, which you can see on the lower part of the image, in Halle Neustadt, which he implemented as a part of a large-scale design concept in Halle Neustadt. With this wall painting and the 2 other murals that belong to it, Renaud succeeded in portraying a utopian vision of socialism characteristic of the 60s, namely the advancement of the youth as, quote, era of progressive developments, quote end, which was a common feature of the 1960s, not only in East Germany, but on a global scale. Crucial for Renaud's muralism in GDR is the combination of avant-garde stylistic elements of classical modernism and contemporary techniques. In addition, it is precisely the mural in Halle Neustadt that represents an excellent example of Renaud's artistic richness of visual invention that contributed to a unique iconography of socialist future visions. In the GDR, Renau was the only visual artist who had lived in Mexico during World War II and had been personally acquainted with the muralism of Rivera, Orozco, and Siqueiros. The double exile experience, so in Mexico and in the GDR, exerted a great influence on his artistic and personal attitudes. Renau's establishment in the GDR fell into a time of increased interest in the contemporary art of Mexico, in the cultural scene of the GDR, and allowed him, after he mainly worked as a graphic artist, to implement large public murals in the GDR since the end of the 1960s. But let's have a look back. In preparation for one of the largest German-wide art exhibitions after World War II that happened in 1949 in Dresden, Mexican muralism was modeled as blueprint for new mural art in East Germany. After the presentation of the results of the collective practice, the state party and critics condemned this attempt, making it very difficult for artists in the GDR to reimagine Mexican muralism. The artistic adaptation of the Mexican was severely restricted by the new emasculation of modernity in the so-called struggle against formalism. While the SED endeavored to bring Rivera and Siqueiros as honorable guests to the Third World Festival of Youth to East Berlin in 1951, both Rivera and Siqueiros were welcomed as peace fighters, but not as artists. It was not until Stalin's death in 1953 that the Mexican image of the GDR was to change, as the exhibition Mexican Painting and Graphics, organized by the Academy of Arts in East Berlin, demonstrated in 1955. After the Dresden-based publishing house Verlag der Kunst gained Rivera in 1955 for a cooperation in the monographic study devoted to him, Rivera was also appointed as a correspondent member of the Academy of Arts. A visit to the GDR followed up in 1956, and he was even asked to design a public mural for the GDR. The years 1955 and 1956 mark a turning point. Mexican modern art was officially recognized as an important source of inspiration for artists in the GDR. In the following years, various publications and translations on Mexican art came out in East Germany, and a public demonstration of solidarity with Siqueiros, who was imprisoned between 1960 and 1964, took place. Finally, Siqueiros visited the GDR in 1970, where he met Renau in his studio in Berlin, and promised, like Rivera before him, to deliver a mural for the GDR, which never became true, unfortunately. In 1965, already 2 years before the publication of first major GDR publication of Mexican contemporary art, called The Man in Flames, Renau underlined at a speech at the University of Rostock in North Germany, quote, the universal rank of the Mexican art, quote end, as well as the significance of the movement of muralismo being one of the, quote, Renau, most important manifestations of contemporary art. Renau declared that the art of Rivera, Orozco, and Siqueiros is the very first episode in the history of art in which, quote, the artistic movement is shaped in its nature by the fact that its representatives actively participated in the social revolution, which generated this motion. That is a huge difference between those pioneers of the modern muralism and the simultaneous European avant-garde painting, quote end. Renau finished his presentation with the statement that form, function, and content of the Mexican muralism formed an entity, quote, every social revolution creates its own expression. The specific expression of the Mexican Revolution has been the muralismo, quote end. Although Renau's engagement for the popularization of Mexican art in the GDR, his own career as muralist in East Germany did not start off easy. Renau's experiences from his homeland Spain and his exile in Mexico that contributed to his abilities in the photographic field, as well as in the interplay between architecture and fine art. For example, he was very important for the 1937 World Exhibition and for the Spanish Pavilion. So this interplay between architecture and fine art formed the basis of his murals in the GDR. However, he did not simply transfer his Spanish-Mexican avant-garde creativity to the GDR, but adopted his methods and solutions to the specifics of the new challenges in East Germany, technically, as well as in the message his paintings contended. Renaud was seemingly able to benefit from the increased interest in Mexican art, so that the first orders for mural paintings in the GDR came up in 1959. The Conquest of Sun and The Elements, commissioned for the Radio Radar Laboratory in Berlin, Adlershof. Both were not executed, but they are still very interesting for our topic, since they show that Renaud had updated and adapted his experiences as photographer and designer of interior spaces for his new task. Two characteristics of the design will be repeated in all subsequent tasks in the GDR. The first one is Renaud rejected a simple reflection of the function of the building in the content of the mural. Instead, he called for a graphic representation, a symbolic pictorial language, and an allegorical approach that should provoke the viewer to think and process. It was the artist's task to find a translation between the represented content and the representational form. And the second motif, Renaud counts with the moving observer, who sees the mural and looks at it from different positions in the space while having different mental, emotional, and intellectual status. The artist therefore had to work with floor plans and urban plans to include statistical and behavioral calculations on the people's ways through the space. In terms of content, the design for Berlin produced a continuity with his Mexican works. He is interested in the man-made environment, in the means of production, and in the conquest of space. But it should last 7 more years before Renaud realized his first mural in the GDR. In 1966, the Deutsche Fernsehfunk commissioned 4 wall paintings with the title The Conquest of Cosmos for a club room. One painting of his contemporaneous painting cycle integrates the Berlin television tower under construction. I hope I have this image. Yeah, you see it on the left photo. The Berlin television tower. In contrast to Renaud's Mexican paintings, the Conquest of the Cosmos was relatively small in size and did not intend a political effect on the masses. But just 1 year later, in 1976, the situation changed completely for Renaud, with the commission for 4 large-scale murals for the educational complex of Halle-Neustadt. And 2 years later, in 1969, Renaud was asked by the architect Richard Paulik to create a mural for the foyer of the Academy of Marxist-Leninist Organizational Theory, long title, in East Berlin. You can see it on the right side. Although Renaud's highly sophisticated mural for a future worker of socialism, that is the title, was not realized, the design gained public attention and was shown in recent exhibitions and on book covers in Germany. In difference to Renaud's design for Berlin of 1966 and 69, which we saw, his proposal for the ceramic wall painting, The Peaceful Use of Nuclear Power of 1970 in Halle, and the glass mosaic, Man in Relation to Nature and Technology of 1984 in Erfurt were executed. For all of these projects, Renaud put in extensive documentation. It can be said that the years around 1970 or the 1960s, when Sukrow visited Berlin and met with Renaud, were the highlight of Renaud's muralism in the GDR. On his visit, Sukrow praised the development of Renaud in the genre of large muralist paintings since he left Mexico. In this highly creative and productive phase of the 60s and 70s, Renaud presented several designs for other murals that were not realized. For example, 1972 for the porcelain factory of Meissen and a housing complex in the new industrial town of Schwedt. He also proposed a mural for the new Palace of Republic in East Berlin in 1974. In all of these works of the 70s, 2 central elements of Renaud's works can be recognized. As I said, a symbolic, allegorical visual language and an intensive examination of the spatial and temporal conditions of the wall paintings. In Halle-Neustadt, built since '64 for the workers of the chemical industry in the district, this Renaud's strategy and methodology can be observed very well. Halle-Neustadt was one of the largest and most ambitious projects of urban development in GDR, and was intended to reflect socialist state consciousness, also with its architectural related art. Located in the northwestern part of Neustadt, the murals for the educational center should be seen as, I quote from the sources, an emphatic expression of the unified socialist educational system. I show you, I go back because I don't have a city plan, but the educational complex is this area here in the north. So this is the main street of Halle-Neustadt. This is the city center, and in the north, these large buildings form the educational district of Halle-Neustadt. It was planned to design murals for a dormitory, a club canteen, a swimming pool, and a chemical laboratory, but the last one was not executed. Renau and his collective, to which René Gretz and Herbert Sandberg also belonged, produced 4 designs, which you can see here, for large format exterior murals on behalf of the Halle-Neustadt Council between 1967 and 68. They created the forces of nature and man's control over nature for the dormitory, these 2 images. The March of the Youth for the canteen, this one here, this one here. As well as the geometry of nature and man for the swimming pool. It's on the left side. In his entire career as muralist, Renau had not been given the opportunity to carry out a series of large-scale murals with a coherent content and form, because the work in Mexico had been interior murals. Not all of Renau's plans for Halle-Neustadt were finished or realized. His objections to the 2 large-scale vertical walls, he preferred a large outer wall area instead, were ignored. So he had to design the forces of nature for the right side, and the unity of working class and the founding of the GDR on the right side. Sorry, this is the forces of nature, and on the right side, the unity of the working class. The design for the right mural was rejected by the party, so he had to redesign it. And today, the solution, we will see it, is this one with the large Marx head. This is the unity of the working class. A very dynamic, forward-pressing and euphoric visual language seemed appropriate for Renau, especially in a heavily frequented public area such as the new education center. Renau hoped for a didactic effect on the viewer of the work. Quote Renau, the picture should trigger a positive impression, so the theme, color, and form had to be appropriate. Already in 1932, Sukrow argued in a very similar manner during a lecture he gave at the John Reed Club in LA. Sukrow addressed the increased public perceivability and effect of the exterior mural and asked for consequences for its production and design, content, and form, including the use of the latest techniques and materials. The presentation of new social political content should go hand in hand with new forms. The propagation of collective exterior wall painting over traditional painting on canvas, and also Sukrow on the murals should show the superiority of collective mechanized work over stingy individual work. So that was Sukrow in 1932. And Renau followed this path for his murals in Halle-Neustadt. In the drafts for his overall planning for the educational center of Halle-Neustadt, Renau's careful rational working method becomes evident, which he had already used during his work with Sukrow in Mexico, namely a dynamic of overall appearance and details that take into account the different observer positions, as well as of the function and significance of the image message that should be adequate to the building in terms of iconography and format. While a noticeable increase in content, design, and motive from bottom to top can be seen in the vertical stairwells, the horizontally positioned canteen building is characterized by a dynamic that develops from right to left. And this follows also the pathway here. So The march of the youth into the future is a movement from right to left, and you as viewer who walks from the dormitory to the canteen will pass besides this mural and follow this movement of the youth, and you are addressed by the mural to do the same. During the 60s and also in the 70s, many architectural thinkers and critics in the GDR discussed the importance of mural painting as an essential part of what they thought to be a socialist architecture. Socialist architecture in GDR has been characterized as the possibility for architects, planners, and designers to create, quote, the urban environment as a coherent organism and to create self-contained spaces of living experience which act on the lifestyle of socialist men and women in many respects, quote end. Architecture therefore had to represent and enable the life of new socialist society in which all negative aspects of capitalism like land speculation and social segregation has been overcome. The synthesis of architecture and visual arts, and you can here see some examples from Berlin, was one of the main issues of the discourses on socialist architecture and urban planning. So it seems no coincidence that Renaud's growing importance as a muralist that happened in the late 60s, because parallel a controversial debate on mural painting and its relationship to architecture and urban planning took place in the GDR. While architecturally, designers created large-scale modernist housing areas as symbols for industrialization and rationalization, mural painters were still detached to classic role models of enlarged canvases on outer walls. We can see the strategy of projecting an image in a rectangular canvas on a wall in the works of Walter Wommacker and his mural for the Haus des Lehrers in Berlin in 1964, or in Dresden at Gerhard Bronzin's mural Der Weg der Roten Fahne for the Center of Performing Arts in Dresden of 1969. The conservatism of these murals created a paradox between the modernist architecture of the international style and the ornamental decorative paintings. The modernity of architecture, linked to economic and aesthetic progress, was not answered in the average mural painting. Renaud aimed at filling this gap through his inventions. Renaud paid respect to the different forms in which a spectator of the mural would perceive and process the artwork. While Wommacker's mural is only correctly visible from one distinct point, Renaud assumed that the modern spectator is often in a rush, coming home tired after work, or passes by with a car. While Wommacker followed the concept of what Renaud called an, I quote him, aesthetic dictatorship of panel painting, quote end, he himself tried to overcome the classic form of the mural painting for a new one, a dynamic and cinematic monumentalism full of new iconographic elements of a socialist utopia. Although only a few of his original designs for murals were executed, his growing public recognition became evident, especially since he was awarded with the Patriotic Order of Merit in 1972. And in 1975, a smaller monographic study about his work came out. Besides that, Renaud established a private school of art. You can see some images here. He established a private school of art in his house and in his atelier in Berlin, in which he not only taught and spoke about his Spanish and Mexican experiences, but also collected books and memorabilia from his journeys and received guests from Spain. Through the financial as well as social recognition of his achievements in the 60s and 70s, Renaud was able to establish this private retreat and to devote himself to a small student body outside the academic enterprise. According to his instructions, studies of natural objects and optical corrections were carried out. In the course of the German reunification of 1989 and 1990, not only a political, social, and economic reorientation took place, but also a shift in aesthetics. The artifacts of the GDR, especially art and architecture in the public space, were usually subjected to rigorous and irreversible revision. In general, a kind of a damnatio memoriae took place in East Germany, as the famous more recent examples of the Lenin Memorial or the Palace of the Republic in Berlin prove. And Renau, in spite of his position, which was already less established in the GDR, and despite his artistic diversity, he was, like many other artists, equated with the state system of injustice and suppression. Interestingly, conservationists that came from the western part of Germany to the former GDR argued for a partly destruction of some of his works. In 1998, the mural, The March of Youth into the Future, was destroyed, being defamed as redundant and trivial from official heritage conservation sites. The mural of Erfurt, which you can see here, was also highly endangered since the carrying building was torn down around 2009. Those decisions for or against the preservation of murals in the public space were often justified economically and due to the missing categories, not from the perspective of preservation. Various initiatives, for example, this is the mural March of the Youth into the Future from which was destroyed in 1999. And you see here on the right side the replacement. Various initiatives, for example, from building research or monument preservation, are increasingly devoting themselves to the architectural heritage of the GDR in the last decade. Activities carried out by the University of Weimar or the Wüstenrot Foundation are excellent examples. These initiatives also provide a basis for the preservation and the research on surviving murals by Renau in Halle, you see on the right side, and Erfurt, you see on the left side. The fact that Renau's works in the GDR has now reached the official discourse in art history, at least partly, has been made possible by exhibitions that included Renau's designs. Most prominently, the great retrospective of GDR art entitled Farewell to Icarus, shown in Weimar in 2012, invited critics and visitors to evaluate Renau's prominent position and quality within the GDR art world. While Renau's works are part of the official canon of Spanish art in the 20th century and were exhibited in major museums like Valencia or Madrid, in Germany, Renau is mostly known not as a complete artist, but more as a designer of murals. To summarize, Renau's work in the GDR of the 60s, from the murals in Halle Neustadt to the latest mural in Erfurt, can be seen as a form of aesthetic diversity and artistic assertiveness against a cultural hegemony that was intended by the ruling party. His achievements as an artist, theoretician, agitator, and teacher are now judged from a more objective point of view than it was the case in the 1990s Germany. The temporal distance to GDR, which now includes more or less a generation, and the continuous historization of art and architecture of the GDR will hopefully lead to more conversation also in Germany on Renau's artistic achievements as part of a shared cultural heritage between Spain, Mexico, and Germany, and also on his new images of socialist men and women. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver, for your brilliant presentation and engaging, for showing us so many images also from the very close past. Yes, I would open the floor to questions, remarks, commentaries. Who would like to break the ice? Margarita, please.
Hi, Oliver. Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question about your title, so maybe you can kind of clarify this for us. What do you mean by spaces of men? Were you thinking as a kind of a mankind, as in humans in general, or specifically men, as in the gender of men? So since I noticed, and I sort of, somewhat relate to this, a field dominated by men as in architecture and murals, since I study male art. In the male art movement, most of the artists are men. And I'm also thinking about, women male artists. So I've been thinking about, gender and art in Eastern Europe for a few years. So I was wondering, were there any famous women muralists in the GDR, for example, as there were in Mexico? And whether you're interested in this question at all, or you're just kind of studying the art of these very talented men, but yeah, just maybe comment on this for us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Yes, there were actually some female muralists. I showed you this image here. I certainly did not pay enough credit to them, sorry, because as you can see here, the collective of Renau is 50-50 men and women. And they were responsible for finishing his last mural in Erfurt. So when he died in '82, this collective finished the job. And Martha Hofmann, for example, you can see her on the upper left. She was very active also in the rescue of the mural and in the re-establishment of the mural a couple of years ago. So she is kind of the link between Renau's work and contemporary preservation movement. You're right with your comment about architecture as a very male-dominated field. A couple of years ago, there was an exhibition in Frankfurt, I guess, in the Architecture Museum. It was about female architects, and I think GDR was represented by two. So there were female architects. In my case studies that I was researching for my dissertation project and also for the other conservation projects, only those buildings were erected by a man, but certainly there is a situation of the collective, or I would say this is a kind of a specific situation in muralism, in the muralist movement, but also in architecture, because there was no, the structure was not like there is an office of male architects and they participate in competitions, but the collective of an office, of an architectural office, for example, city architects, had a lot of female architects as well. So this should be addressed. Thank you for making us aware of that. And the title, yeah, I know I was also kind of unsatisfied with the title the closer the lecture came. But as I tried to make it clear in the beginning, this is a quote to these two exhibitions and a Darmstadt talk. So it's more a historic quotation. And of course in the meaning of mankind. Humankind. Yeah, humanity. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sven. Microphone, we can't hear you.
Thank you for your talk. I found it extremely intriguing. And I mean, I think my question in a way has been largely answered. I'm particularly interested in the relationship with the Mexican muralists and also your remarks on the position of the spectator. So from the little I know about the muralists and the murals I've seen in Mexico, many of them are not quite on the outside of buildings the way they are on the murals you have shown, which are truly on the outside, facing, you know, a big, busy street. But in those cases that I've seen, I mean, the famous ones in Mexico City, where they would be like in these inner courtyards, often with colonnades, so that they would sort of invite you to stop in front of the images. And these images would often be sequential, rather than being one large image. And so kind of going back to your super intriguing diagram, you know, with the different movements that people perform as they walk by the murals, I'm just curious, you mentioned the didactic function of the murals. In the case of the Mexican muralists, that's clearly, as far as I can see, linked to the seriality of these images. In other words, we're confronting not just one image, but we're confronting a series of images that often tell a story, you know, that allegorize certain, you know, narratives that unfold their didactic potential over time. That seems to be rather different. And, you know, I see the difference that you were elaborating between, you know, between the murals you discussed and the more conservative type. But the one thing they share is this sort of sense that there's one image, you know, that's actually not true. There was one that actually curves around. So I may be totally wrong with this. Or in other words, the difference I'm trying to I'm trying to define here may not be categorical. It may mean, be more nuanced than I'm making out here. But I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on the difference between the didactic program and its enactment, let's say, in concrete terms, as far as the spectator goes, between Mexican muralism on the one hand and, let's say, the images you have shown us on the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. And a very inspiring question. Okay. First of all, you are right with your observation that the Mexican murals are often in inside buildings or semi-public spaces. I think this has to do, because there are other examples, but this has to do with the history, building history. I think a lot of these murals were painted after the building was erected. So this historical buildings. Another example is Siqueiros University, where you have exterior murals, but this was a contemporary project. So in the GDR, architects had to work with visual artists, although the latter ones were not really satisfied with this collaboration. And they had to, as you can see here in this image, they had to prepare spaces on the facade for public art, also for statues, for reliefs, for monumental plates with inscriptions, stuff like that. Behind all these murals and all these public art was a kind of an elaborated plan that every new town project had. And this was called the iconography of the town. And they devoted specific parts of the districts of the new town to specific kind of messages. So one district was devoted to education, as you can see here. Another district was devoted to chemical industry and the worker. Another district was devoted, etc., etc. So that didactic, or I think inhabitants were really briefed about what they saw there, because it was public, this knowledge, what you can expect from the murals, the topics, and the iconography. Because they published these descriptions for the inhabitants. So we find in the architectural papers or in the newspapers long lists of artworks and also an interpretation for those artworks. So it was really top-down approach in didactics. Another comment to your observation with the sequencing of images is absolutely correct. Siqueiros, for example, he was, I think, really interested in the cinema. And at one point he was saying, forget the mural painting, we need projectors. We just show images or movies on the wall, but we don't paint anymore. Renaud was not so radical, but he tried to include this form of narration and this form of temporality into his murals. As I tried to explain, his images are very complex and very often they have a own space, they claim, and often they invite the viewer to move around and to come closer or get a little distance to it. He describes this with his, as you say, the plans with the behavior of the viewer. So this was his thing. He made extensive documentation of his project, starting with the analysis of the floor plan, starting with the analysis of the city plan. So he was really a behavioral scientist, I would say. And then he tried to include these sequence of images into one painting. But yeah, I think to sum up, the difference between Mexican muralism and GDR muralism is not only the technique, because this is tiles and Mexican muralism is fresco most of the time, but it's also the way of narration and the way of sequencing the history of the painting or the storyline. So yeah.
Thank you.
One is more cinematic than the other.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Well, I have maybe one question. I was intrigued also by another expression that you used, the global 60s, referred to the GDR. And so I was wondering if you could say something more about the status of Renau as an international artist, right? That you also mentioned this sort of double exile. And so from to Mexico and then to the GDR. So and there were not many of them, right? As far as I know, there were artists that in a way could inscribe into this internationalism. So you mentioned Siqueiros, of course. I'm thinking also about being in Italy, about Renato Guttuso, artists that were very much exhibited. I mean, Guttuso was mostly a painter and not so much active in the architecture or applied arts, but still they were touring, right, in the GDR. While Reina was really lived there for the rest of his life, basically. So if you could just elaborate a little bit, this also referring to internationalism. If I'm not wrong, I mean, Reina can really be inscribed into this internationalist heritage or even visual culture, right? Being one of the authors of the Spanish Pavilion World Expo, right, in 1937. So and how this really inscribed into the global 60s in the GDR in terms of cultural policy and visual arts and political discourse.
Thank you very much. I think Renau, he was, although he hadn't had much opportunity to create murals, as I said, he was frequently used by GDR cultural policies to show the international recognition and the connections to Mexico and to Spain and to the avant-garde movement. So he was interviewed a lot about this when he was in GDR. So Renau, please speak to us about your Mexican experience. Speak to us about the Spanish Civil War. So he was kind of he had this bridge function between a younger generation of artists in the GDR who were interested in these avant-garde and also in the not only in the but also in the cultural politics of the interwar times. This is one aspect of an answer, but another aspect of an answer is that when Franco died, I hope I'm not wrong, but I think it's 72 or something like that, or 74. I don't remember. Renau, when that happened, he was so active in Spain again, to reclaim this Republican heritage and this avant-garde movement in Spain. And the first Spanish contribution for the Venice Biennale after Franco's death was devoted to Spanish Republican art before Franco. And of course, Renau was in Venice. So and this pavilion was devoted entirely to this historization of the avant-garde movement in Spain. And interestingly enough, he didn't show any artworks from the GDR in this pavilion. He only showed the works that he has done in Spain and Mexico. And this is also very interesting because I think he saw a new window of opportunity in Spain after Franco's death. And he also moved back to Valencia. That's why his archive is in Valencia. The foundation is in Valencia. So he really cut this GDR history. And maybe this is also kind of an interesting development in the 60s and 70s. Europe reorganizes in a way, or the cultural sphere reorganizes after the death of Franco and other. And because the climate, I think, under Honecker in the 70s was not in favor of Renau. So I think he hoped that he could reestablish himself in Spain. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a very important edition, the one in 1976. It was not just the pavilion; it was the whole Biennale was dedicated to post-Franco art.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it was a very an overwhelming show of the art after the end of Franco and his dictatorship. Thank you. Maybe I have just one. I just was curious about also the what has been preserved from Halle Neustadt, because you mentioned this impressive plan, and so and I've never been there, unfortunately, but no, I really feel that maybe the sooner the better. So just wanted to know what is there now.
Okay, you see on the right side what has been preserved, and just recently, a couple of months ago, the right tower, the right image, was restored. So these two images, the forces of nature and the unity of the working class, are now restored and very colorful and very bright. And there's one other mural in Halle near the main station that is not in a good status, and the other ones are destroyed. So Erfurt, the one on the left, and the 3 ones in Halle. This is left which is not so bad, given the situation in the last 25 years, in which so many of the public artworks have been destroyed and not even not even documented.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So
I think we lost Sven, right?
Yes, Sven had to leave because he had classes right now. We also lost Mohammad Reza. But yeah, I think if there are no other questions, I think it's a nice conclusion now with this insight into the post-GDR period, and also with different fates and fortunes that happen to different buildings or heritages from this short, at the same time long period of German art and architecture. So as I said, today it's really our last lecture. So it was really a pleasure and to have very often also many of you intervened and attended during many of our lectures. So yes, I would like to thank everybody. First of all, Sven, even if he's not here anymore, for proposing this co-organized series of lectures. And yes, it's 8 o'clock, so it's time for us in Europe to have dinner. And yeah, thank you, of course, Oliver, yes, I hope to be able to organize something in the future on this. Taking advantage from this fruitful initiative. So thank you, everybody, and good evening or good rest of the day for all of you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.